Haidete o Philoi. I'm Fletcher from amindforlanguage.com, and you're listening to Greeking Out, a podcast for ancient and Koine Greek learners full of tools, tips, and possibly tirades on learning Greek using comprehension-based methods. If that isn't familiar to you, check out episode 0, the manifesto, for more info. In this episode, I interview James Tauber about the Greek Learner Text Project. James is the, or at least one of the chief instigators for the project that aims to help teachers and learners teach and learn Greek better. You'll get a lot of good linguistics and language learning theory in this episode, as James and I talk about Greek vocab lists and the order to learn things in. This episode's a little different, but it's valuable and was a lot of fun to record. Check out the show notes for links to various resources mentioned. And now, without further ado, let's jump in. Well, hi, James. Thanks for being willing to do the interview.
My pleasure. Great to be here.
I guess I probably ran into you first on Twitter or maybe through your website or something like that, or it may have been through Seamus McDonald back 5 or 6 years ago now. But
yeah, probably Twitter. Yeah. I remember. Yeah.
It's funny. And like we were saying before we started recording, it's kind of the first time we've ever met or communicated in real time, aside from the Slack group. So let me just start off with, how did you get interested in Greek? What was your first steps into it?
Yeah, so it happened at university. I was particularly interested, I became interested in biblical languages, and I did a little bit of Hebrew, just teaching myself, and then Greek for the New Testament, and I really fell in love with Greek, and particularly, and this will become relevant as we continue on, particularly interested in doing stuff on computers with the Greek language. I ended up doing a semester of classical Greek while I was an undergraduate student. Although significantly, I changed majors. I had started off as a physics and mathematics major at university, but then ended up switching to linguistics, to general linguistics, in part because of the fascination that I had for the Greek language. And I've sort of basically continued to be interested in the study of Greek, of ancient Greek, since then. I went back many years later, some 20 years later, I guess, and did graduate study in classical Greek, and have continued to, since then to do research in the area of Greek. But its origins were as an undergraduate student and an interest in the biblical language in particular. That's
interesting. Actually, I when I was doing my undergraduate, I initially was thinking, I'll get into teaching biblical languages. Mm-hmm. And I dabbled with some linguistics, not really knowing what it was, like reading a book or two. I think David Allen Black's Linguistics of New Testament Greek. And I thought, this will help make, learning these languages easier, which I think is true. But then I ran into linguists and I was like, this sounds fun. And took a phonetics class, and, that was just that was the end of it. So I switched into linguistics, and I've done Greek on the side.
Yeah, there's a lot of people that go that direction. I mean, the joke is that a lot of failed language learners become linguists. Not suggesting you're a failed language learner, but certainly in my case, I realized that in a lot of the time I was more interested in the mechanics and the history and the sort of scientific study and modeling of the language than I was actually learning it myself. That's not to say I don't want to learn the language, but in terms of what I found easier, I mean, I think it's always the case that it's easier to talk about things than to actually learn them, internalize them, and so on. Certainly in my case, it was the linguistic side of things that really took over.
Well, it's funny that you say failed language learners, because I mean, honestly, my facility in Greek was pretty crummy. And it really wasn't until after I'd already done linguistics, and done a graduate degree in linguistics and learned a modern language, that I really came back to Greek and had the time to throw at it and sort of knew what I was doing.
Yeah.
and also using, comprehension based methods.
Well, that was a big thing. So I have only ever formally done sort of grammar translation
Right.
Greek, and I've done grammar translation of other historical languages as well, Old English, Old Norse, and been somewhat frustrated by those approaches, and really been interested in alternative, uh, scientifically informed
Yes.
ways of actually looking at these historical languages.
So, given the list of languages you've mentioned and the fact that I see a couple of Tolkien books in the background, are you going to be a linguist, or are you trying to become a new Tolkien in terms of his philology?
So it was funny. I mean, I always had an interest in sort of comparative philology in the context of Greek. So right from the early stages of being interested in Greek, I was interested in also Indo-European linguistics as well, relationship between Greek and other Indo-European languages, and historical linguistics in general. One of my favorite classes in linguistics was historical linguistics, and I was always interested in. I had no idea that I could study other branches of the Indo-European language family historically until maybe 8 years ago, when I discovered Signum University, an online university that I'm now affiliated with, now work for, and they had a strong emphasis on Tolkien studies and Germanic philology, and so it was a realization that you could study Old English and Old Norse and study Germanic languages and historical linguistics, the development from Proto-Indo-European through Proto-Germanic and into the daughter languages of Germanic, and at the same time learn about Tolkien and so on, because that was his field of expertise as well. So I have always been a Tolkien fan. Tolkien planted the seeds for linguistics in me. When I did start studying linguistics, I realized that a lot of the terminology I was learning, particularly in phonetics and phonology, I would come across terms like, velar stops and things like that. And I'm like, I know these terms. How do I know these terms? And I realized that they were the terms that Tolkien used in Appendix E of Lord of the Rings, where he's describing how to pronounce his Elvish languages. Being a philologist, he's using the terminology, and his writing systems, in particular, Tengwar, his Elvish writing system, is extremely systematic and tied to articulatory phonetics, right? So the way you write the letters in Elvish are indicative of whether it's voiced or unvoiced, whether it's a stop or a fricative, whether it's a bilabial or a velar. And so that kind of scientific view of the sounds of a language, I had been exposed to as a Tolkien fan, at the age of 12, basically, and that planted the seed in linguistics. So coming back to your question, though, in terms of what I'm trying to do, it's funny because I kind of now have this, I won't even say dual, because it's three or four part research interest that covers both ancient Greek and Tolkien studies, studying Tolkien's works themselves as objects of philology, as well as the Germanic languages that he himself studied.
So the takeaway for Greek learners is go grab a copy of Lord of the Rings and read Appendix E if you're struggling with
That's right.
if you're struggling with all the grammar terms.
At least the sounds. The
At
sounds
least it
anyway.
sounds.
Yeah.
There we go. But just as an aside, I think that's one of the things that's difficult for Greek learners is you get these forms, and then you're doing grammar translation or whatever, and then you hit the chapter where you have contract verbs and aorist that
Mm-hmm.
run into stops, and now you have a C when you had stuff before, and it's like, wait, what happened? And then it's like, if you kind of look at it as phonetics, it's like, oh, this makes sense now. But
Well, it's funny. I remember when I was first getting into Greek myself, I had a friend who was not coming from a linguistics background. He was a historian, and I remember he had just encountered third declension nouns, and he was horrified by them. And I was like, "What are you talking about? They're lovely. They're wonderful, because you get to see phonology in action. You get to see the this sort of square of stops inside." I found it fascinating because I could see an underlying reason behind it,
right.
as a linguist that he couldn't. The same thing happens with many so-called irregular verbs. It's true in English too, that the things that tend to surface as irregularities do have an underlying regularity that just kind of got messed up at one point because of various sound changes. And once you work out what those sound changes are, it's not the way native language learners do it, but as a historical linguist, once you sort of unlock some of the reasons for those irregularities, they actually become objects of beauty rather than objects of frustration.
It's like, yes, this all made perfect sense 500 years before the version of the language you were currently trying to learn. Okay. So what I really wanted to ask you about, besides just how you got into things, is the Greek Learners Text Project.
Yeah.
I think that's a cool resource, ostensibly for learners. At least that's the goal, right? So just give me a brief overview. What is it? And
so
what's the point?
Yeah, well, it's worth talking about its origins because it came about on Twitter. Really, it started off because of a conversation on Twitter amongst a few of us that were wanting individually to tackle certain aspects of learning or helping others to learn Greek. So one of the things that I had been doing for a long time was looking at vocabulary, and in particular vocabulary ordering, to better enable reading of texts. One of the things that I'd been exploring, I think I started doing this in the early 2000s, was to take a particular text in Greek and work out, what words you needed to know to learn that text, and then to answer the question, well, what order should I read the texts in order to more smoothly get introduced to new vocabulary? And so I became very interested in this as sort of a computational question, right? How could I write computer software to do this, to take texts and to work out what the optimal ordering was so that you could start off with easier texts and get to more complicated texts? Because one of the interesting things that becomes very clear once you start to dive into that is that frequency is not necessarily the only measure that needs to be taken into account, in part because let's take the New Testament, just because that's what I had started off this working on. You take any verse of the Greek New Testament, and even if it's got some of the most common words of all in the New Testament, it's also going to have some uncommon words. And if you delay the learning of the uncommon words, it takes a lot longer to get to the verse. So if you allow yourself to slip in a few uncommon words that happen to co-occur or collocate with more frequent words, you can get to reading full verses sooner. And so I'd done a bunch of research into sort of algorithms for doing this. And, what order would you read the various pericopes of the Greek New Testament in order to smooth the learning of vocabulary? And in order to do that, I needed to have, well, I guess I should say the first realization that I had was that the New Testament is not big enough for that to be a nice, smooth beginning. Once you know a certain amount of vocabulary, you can fairly easily work out a nice progression through the Greek New Testament. But in terms of just getting started, it's a long time before you get to the kind of vocabulary coverage that you need to be able to just sit down and read a sentence or much less a paragraph.
Yeah,
go on.
I was going to say I've run some of your ordering tools and used them to teach and stuff, and it's cool, but it's like all of the introductions to Paul's epistles are basically the same, and you only can
right.
You can work learners through that pretty easily, but it kind of gets boring after a while. So it'd be nice to be able to get to longer stories, longer pericopes that still have relatively simple structure and vocabulary, but like you said, there's all these other words that are there.
And so I came to the conclusion that we just really needed a larger corpus, right? So we needed a lot more texts that had been lemmatized, so every word basically mapped to what the dictionary form of the word is, because that's how you want to typically track vocabulary, although there's other issues there that I can get into that's not the only thing you need to track. So there was that sort of interest I had in lemmatizing more Greek texts. At the same time, there was this sort of discovery that happened for me, and I think some other people as well, of just how much Greek had been produced in at the turn of the 19th to 20th century that was specifically aimed at solving this problem, having interesting stories, not just one-off sentences or phrases to translate, but interesting stories that were deliberately controlled in their vocabulary to get somebody who's was just starting out reading early on. And so there'd been this discussion on Twitter about, oh, wouldn't it be great if on the one hand we had more Greek texts that were lemmatized, particularly the kinds of texts that people were interested in reading, whether it was the New Testament or Plato was another popular one that a lot of people want to read. That on the one hand, but then on the other hand, all of these early 20th century easy Greek readers that were all out of copyright. They all exist as sort of scanned copies of books on the Internet Archive. And it occurred to me that we really should, the people that were interested in this sort of stuff should maybe get together and collaborate on lemmatizing, authentic texts from 2,000, 2,500 years ago on the one hand, but also digitizing these early Greek readers from the turn of the 20th century. And if we did those two things, we would have a wealth of texts for Greek learners to take advantage of. So that was sort of the origin of the Greek Learner Text project, doing those two things in addition to tooling around all of that. So you already mentioned this, some software that I've written for helping with vocabulary ordering, and you've worked on it with me over the years as well. And we have grand plans for more stuff there in the future. But that's really what the Greek Learner Text project has been about, bringing together people who are interested in preparing texts, authentic or these early Greek readers from the 20th century, as well as tools for doing interesting things to facilitate learning with those texts.
So it sounds like there's kind of two sides to the project, and ultimately the goal is helping learners, right? So if I'm just reiterating it correctly, we've got part of the project is to provide tools for people who want to create or digitize text for learners, and then the other side is, if you're a learner, you could go here and potentially find resources that have been created for you.
Yeah, I think I would say that there's a pretty decent focus on material for teachers to use.
Right.
Even the texts that we're preparing, I think, would probably typically be embraced by teachers who want to use them rather than, students could use them for sure. But most of the way I think about it is facilitating teachers who want material to use for teaching Greek. One thing that I didn't explicitly touch on was this whole idea of also newly written Greek texts as well. So one of the things that at the same time that all this was happening, one of my main conversational partners in all of this is James McDonald, who you mentioned right at the start. And, a lot of my motivation has been, what can I do to help him to teach better and produce materials and so on. One of the things that he has long been working on is, an original born digital reader, essentially. His Lingua Graecae per se Illustrata, or LGPSI, I could see some potential tooling that could be built to help him with the construction of that. And what's interesting about that is the work that I did with that is now being used by Colin Gorey, who's teaching Old English using an original text that he is writing. He's using the same tools, though. So one of the things I'm really excited to start to see and would love to continue to support is the use of this approach and the kind of infrastructure of the Greek Learner Text project applied to all sorts of historical languages, because the tooling is applicable to any historical language, not just Greek.
It's neat that you mentioned him. Actually, I sent him a message on Twitter a couple of days ago and said, "Hey, could I interview you for the podcast?" And he's like, "Yeah, I'm buried under a pile of work. Let's come back to this in a couple of months. It'd be fun." So And I told him I was interviewing you next, and or
Yep.
no, sorry, that was somebody else. But someone else that I was talking to was excited about this interview.
Okay.
Anyway, but that's cool. Hopefully by the time he's done that, he'll have made some more. In a couple of months, he'll have made some progress on his reader, and I can ask him about
Yeah, he's made
his
quite
view
a
as a user of the tools.
yeah, he's made a lot of progress, and so he's been teaching. He's starting. One of the reasons he's probably a little too busy to talk at the moment. He's about to start a new cohort of his old English class, and so I know he's very busy preparing for that, but it's not the first time he's run it. So he's been using this approach for about a year now, and I think with a lot of success, because it does. So just to explain, the tool that I wrote for Seamus that's now being used by Colin, one of the things that it does is the main thing it does is it just tracks vocabulary as you are writing your story. So we'll tell you things like, oh, you've introduced this many words in this chapter, and you can decide whether that's too many or too few. You can look at words that you'd introduced in the past that maybe you haven't used for a certain amount of time. So I can kind of give you, it's not writing it for you, but it's instead giving you feedback about, maybe you're introducing too much new vocabulary here. Maybe you're not reusing enough of the vocabulary that needs to be repeated, and so on. So that's really what the goal of that particular tool was, to help teachers to produce new material in a historical language.
So I think of like Carla Hurt, who's done some really great work of leveled readers,
Yep.
the Aeneid, or things like that. So say my goal is to produce maybe a leveled version of an existing text.
Yep.
Would this be something you could use that for too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so that brings up a couple of points, right? When you're doing any kind of leveled reader, right? So the question is, what should my vocabulary be that I limit my text to? And then how do I ensure that the text that I'm writing fall within certain constraints? And both of those two questions are really things that I'm trying to help with in the Greek Learner Text project. So on the one hand, one of the things that I'm trying to do is also produce better vocabulary list information for people, right? So what are the first 1,000 words you should learn in Greek, or 2,000 or 3,000? One of the things that I started to get frustrated with, that motivated the Greek Learner Text project as well, is I was reading all this wonderful research from people like Paul Nation and so on about second language reading and vocabulary in particular. And they would give all these wonderful examples of how many exposures you needed to particular words, what sort of level you needed to be at for a certain number, a certain vocabulary size, and so on. And none of that information was directly applicable to Greek, because no one had any idea of what are the words in the 3,000 band or the 4,000 band of Greek, right? And so one thing I'm trying to do with the Greek Learner Text project, and I've worked with Seamus and others on this, is having those kind of bands of vocabulary, to get a sense of what should we start with, where shall we go. And so there's been some work we've done in trying to put together a balanced learner corpus to then draw frequency information from that to decide what should be the first X thousand words of Greek. So that's one part of it. But the second part of it is, once you've decided your vocabulary, you want to analyze a text based on how much coverage that vocabulary list gives you of that text. And depending on the kind of reading you want to do, you want to hit certain coverage targets, right? If you're reading for fluency, you really want to have at least 98% of the words already known to the reader, right? If you're doing any kind of extensive reading, you want it to be in that 95 to 98% kind of zone. Anything less than 95%, certainly less than 90%, is going to require a lot more work on the part of the student, intensive reading where they're stopping and they're thinking about what does this word mean, and so on. And you want to be aware of that, right? You want to be able to take a text, whether it's an existing text or a text that you're writing yourself, and say, given this vocabulary list and this text, what kind of coverage am I going to get? And so that's, again, a big thing I'm trying to facilitate with the the Greek Learner Text project, on top of all of the actual preparation of texts, digitization of out of copyright texts, and lemmatization of authentic texts as well.
Yeah, and I can, having been in the text project for, I guess since its inception, really.
Yeah. You were one of the initial people on Twitter that was brought together for this. Yes.
Which I kind of find is hilarious to some ways, because that I knew very little about what I was getting into. I can throw a Python script together, but anyway. Um, but having been around for a while, it is neat to see how different people from a variety of institutions, or just individuals, contribute. Like, some are better at OCRing, the actual digitization of the PDFs, and like you contribute a ton of tooling and Python packages and algorithms and such to help us analyze and stuff. So it's been really cool to be a part of it. There's some really top-notch people um in the world hanging out in there.
Yeah, it's a really great group. It is. Yeah.
Again, my focus for this podcast is primarily towards learners and helping
Yep.
helping, I guess, beginners or intermediate learners make progress. So what would you say for them at this point are the primary benefits of things they might find on the Greek Learners Text Project site?
Yeah, I mean, I think for learners, probably the most immediately useful thing is the digitization that we're doing of these early 20th century. It's a shame in many respects. It's sad looking at the history of this, that the way that Greek was being taught at the turn of the 20th century, in some senses, is better than it was taught later on in the 20th century. That was in part due to just, well, the horrible effects of the First World War on the classics teaching, basically. But it was one of the reasons. But these texts early on, right, there was such an emphasis on getting people to just read large amounts of text that was recognized by the late 19th century. That was recognized as the real way to learn historical languages. The grammar translation technique really went out of fashion at the end of the 19th century. It only came back because it's really, to be honest, the easiest way to teach. Not necessarily the best way to learn, but it's the easiest way to teach. And so the sort of direct method way of teaching, where you have these wonderfully graded readers, was really popular at the turn of the century. And so we're trying to digitize as many of those as possible and make them available. So I would definitely suggest that students take a look at the texts that we're digitizing, the out of copyright texts that we're digitizing, because there's some really nice stories there that you can read that take you from a pretty early stage. The only thing I would say that we suffer from a little bit with these particular readers from the early 20th century is the accompanying grammar descriptions tend to assume a knowledge of Latin. Right. This is the one thing that's changed. It used to be the case at the turn of the 20th century. It was the case that you started with Latin and you did a few years of Latin and then were able to pick up Greek. So there's a little bit of some of these readers do kind of make that assumption, but for the most part, because they're focused on just having text rather than grammatical, they do a really good job of easing people in. In many cases, they are deliberately designed to head you in a particular direction in terms of authentic texts that you would then be able to read. This is another sort of big question, right? Depending on whether your interests are reading the New Testament or reading Plato or reading Xenophon or Thucydides or something, right? You potentially want to pick up a different set of vocabulary along the way. And most of these readers are very much designed to get you to being able to read Xenophon or Thucydides. And one of the things that I'm certainly interested in seeing is alternatives for different, like if you're more interested in philosophy and Plato, what are some ways of getting to that sooner? Just to bring up Colin Gorey's Old English again, he's deliberately writing his works to get you to the point where you can read Beowulf. And so it's nice having that sort of target to give you a sense of the vocabulary and constructions but there's good stuff there for learners, and that's certainly what I would suggest they can make best use of in the Greek Learner Text project.
I know one of the things that I have found really cool as I've helped produce digitized texts is the Altheos project,
Mm-hmm.
which lets you embed a JavaScript library so that if you double click or long tap a Greek word, if it's all set up correctly, it'll search for it and try to give you a definition. And I think from my perspective, the downside of that is it's kind of doing on the fly analysis and guessing as best it can, trying to parse it and
Right.
figure out what's the lexical form. So, you have to kind of weed through and maybe guess which one of the five options it actually is that you're looking at.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I think
So
that's one of the advantages of the things that Greek Learner Text project is producing is that we're often lemmatizing it. So we're saying this is the root. So now you want to look it up in a dictionary, it's right there.
well, I mean, that's why lemmatization is such a big part of it. So, certainly there's value in just having the text themselves, and you can use something like Alpheus to help scaffold the reading when you just have the surface text. But at the end of the day, if you have the text lemmatized, so you've actually associated with each word what to look up in the dictionary effectively, there's a couple of things you get from that. If a human is going and sort of disambiguating that limit. One is that you can have a much more accurate lookup as a learner, right? You can make a much more accurate link between a word in a text and what the entry to read. But the other reason that the lemmatization of these texts is so important for what we're trying to do in the Greek Learner Text project is that's how you extract what the vocabulary is in a text. You need to lemmatize it to really have any sense of what the vocabulary for a text is, and therefore, is it what vocabulary needs to be learnt beforehand, or given a vocabulary list of what you've already learnt, what's the coverage that you can achieve on this. But that brings up another point that I do want to mention here, which is, again, very early on in this whole process, prior to the Greek Learner Text project, I realized that even though lemmatization is key and it's a really, really important part of it, it's not the only thing that ultimately you need to do, because in an inflected language like Greek, it's not necessarily the case that just because you know the dictionary word, you are able to recognize every single inflected form of that.
Oh, you mean the
word.
near 100 forms of the participle might be difficult for people to pick
Exactly.
out
Well,
out in the wild?
the participle's probably amongst the easier, but yeah, I mean, it's you have hundreds of verb forms.
Yeah.
I think I counted once that just in the Greek New Testament, in terms of sort of the morphosyntactic properties, the different combinations of aspect and tense and mood and person and number and so on you can have in the Greek New Testament extant is 374 or something, right? So I have not worked out what it actually is. It'd be at least 400 forms of the verb. What's interesting about it though is, right, sometimes, so you've got two extremes. You could model this as, you could assume that once you know the dictionary form of the word, you know all the inflected form. That will massively overestimate how much you could read. But at the other end of the spectrum, you could just model individual forms and say, I'm only going to treat you as knowing this word if you've seen this exact form before. But that's the other end of the spectrum, but it's equally bad because you're going to lose any kind of generalization about morphology. Only takes you a certain number of times to realize that if the nominative singular is ending in os, then the accusative singular is going to end in on, right? You don't need to treat every single one of those as a new form to learn. And so it raises the question, though, of how do you model the sort of knowledge of morphology, and so incorporate that into evaluating whether a text is ready for a student or not. So it's modeling sort of knowledge of different declensions and so on, but also knowledge of principal parts. There's a reason why principal parts emerged in the analysis of Greek, because they're really trying to get to the bottom of what are the minimum things you need to know about a verb to be able to generate the various inflections of it. And sometimes principal parts are very easy to work out from one another. Sometimes they're not, right? And so ultimately, it's not just about not just vocabulary that I'm hoping we model in these texts, but also the interrelationship between different forms that the words take. In some cases, you've got verbs that are completely what linguists call suppletive. So the root of the present is completely unrelated to what's used for the aorist. So you get things like Lego and epon, which have no relationship to one another. But they're effectively the present and the aorist of one another. And so you really need to almost treat those as distinct words, right? Just because somebody's learnt Lego doesn't mean they'll recognize any of the epon forms, right? So you really want to just treat those as two vocabulary items. But then you get interesting ones coming back to this idea of things being seeming irregular, but there is a historical regularity to them. You get second aorists like where you have elabon in the aorist, where you've got this root lab. But then in the present, it's lambano. And you sort of think, what's lambano got to do with elabon? But it turns out it's actually a completely consistent, regular relationship between the aorist and the present. You just have to understand that with the second aorist, what's happened is the present has been derived from the aorist, not the aorist from the present. When you get something, you learn luo and you discover that the aorist is elusa, you sort of taught, the way I make the aorist is I take the present and I add a sa to it, right? That only works for those verbs that started as present and then you derived the aorist from that. But there's a whole nother category of verbs where you start with the aorist and you create the present out of the aorist. And so you get elabon in the aorist and then lambano, where what's happened is you've inserted a nu in the middle of the lub and at the end of the lub, and the nu has become a mu because it's next to a b, a bilabial. It's this coming back to this phonology that we talked about at the start,
for the win.
Right? Once you understand the fact that it's assimilation to the following bilabial, it actually turns out to be completely consistent that it's lambano that's the present of elabon. But modeling that kind of knowledge, I think, is ultimately, it's not something that is a completely solved problem. It's something I'm continuing to do research on. But that incorporating that aspect of the language, of what it means to know a language, is important alongside the vocabulary as well, because I think that leads to much better evaluation of whether a text is readable at a given point. That said, I think you get to a particular point where it does end up being almost entirely about vocabulary. Right. So early on, it's these sort of inconsistencies and so on, seeming inconsistency that can trip you up. And then you reach a point where I've got a couple of thousand words under my belt. Now it's really just learning more vocabulary, so I get better and better coverage of more and more text.
Yeah, I can say I'd see that in my own life. Like I've got I've engineered a reader for Homer's Iliad book 1, and there's problems where I'm like, oh, you wouldn't say that in biblical Greek this way, or like, man, right. These wait, why is this phrase split in weird places in the poem, like in the line of poetry and stuff, like, so I having to wrap my head around that. But really, a lot of the difficulty comes down to this vocabulary is just so different than what I'm used to.
Yeah.
That it takes, it just takes a while. So, I find that with Septuagint too. It's like, yeah. It's basically the same Greek as the New Testament, and in some ways it's easier because you're reading really big, long stories that have the same characters and things like that. But again, there's just so much vocabulary that you don't get if you just start in the NT.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's depending on how well it maintains your interest. There's nothing wrong with sort of moving slowly and not necessarily extending the vocabulary too quickly. Like, I think we rush into things in some senses too much. One of the things that always shocks me about grammar translation in particular is that the learning of the sounds of the language and the alphabet and so on is sort of relegated to, oh, this is lesson zero. This is something you need to read on the weekend before the class starts, right? Contrast that with the way that babies learn a language when they're basically spending a year just learning to reproduce the sounds. I think there's certain aspects in the early stages of a language where it's really worth taking the time to just listen and read, even if you don't understand it, right? Just get used to the sequences of sounds and so on in the language. And even though, to your point, there's a big jump in sort of the vocabulary necessary even to the Septuagint from the Greek New Testament, building a certain level of fluency and comfort, even within just a more narrow set of vocabulary, is not necessarily a bad thing. Right. You don't want to take on too much at once. One of the things that often gets said, and I think that this is a two sides to this coin, right? This whole issue of, one of the issues with reading, say, the New Testament is, if you're familiar with the text, you can kind of guess, so you're not necessarily learning the language. Because if you're familiar with the story, it's good to read unfamiliar stories. That's true to a point, but also at the same time, there's nothing wrong with a decent amount of your reading being material that you have seen before. That's how you build fluency. And you pick up the patterns and so on. I mean, you think about it, anyone who's a parent of young kids will know that kids love watching the same movie or TV show over and over and over and over again.
No, really.
And when adults were like, how can you watch this for the 50th time, sort of thing? But I think what's happening there is that the kids they're building their fluency, right? They're going over and over again. Each time they're picking up just something new, because the first time they saw it, they didn't pick up nearly as much as you think they did. And then the next time they pick up a bit more, next time a bit more. So it's one thing that I often think about with regard to reading, particularly in the biblical stories where people are familiar with them before they're even going into the Greek. There's nothing wrong with a decent amount of your reading being familiar material, because that's how you do build fluency and really internalize the constructions that you're seeing and so on. It's good to, also be introducing new stuff, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with a lot of repetition, as long as you don't get bored, I guess. That's the main thing there.
I was actually reading one of Paul Nation's books, like, what do you have to know to learn a language? That's freely available. So if you're into language learning, for the audience, grab it, read through it. It'll help you as you shape, think about your Greek. But I was reading that, and he talks about just reworking with simple things that really well to develop, fluency in reading or listening comprehension or whatever. And I think, like you were saying, we may try to move too quickly and try to, especially if our goal is to get to reading the New Testament or get to reading Plato. We need to slow down and work with the things and really develop fluency in a smaller set before moving on sometimes. And like you're saying too, as you're reading G&T, if you're reading the Greek New Testament or something you're familiar with, that's reducing your cognitive load. So your brain is more freed up to process the structure of the language, or, hey, wait, that verb changes forms some weird way. But you already know what it's supposed to be saying. So then you can get a little bit more explicit focus on how the language is working, rather than spending so much energy just on comprehension.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that I really learned from Paul Nation's stuff is this: there are different things you're trying to achieve at different points with the text, right? Sometimes you're reading for fluency, sometimes you're reading for extensive reading, sometimes for intensive reading, and you really want a combination of all those, right? You want to have periods of time when you're reading something that you're so familiar with that it's not taking any effort at all. You're still going to pick up some stuff and reinforce something, but you want to spend some time where it's more extensive reading, where you're able to read large quantities of it. Maybe you have to occasionally think about things, but then you also, it's fine having sometimes where you're really having to think what's going on, and you're really looking at, okay, this is the verb, and this is the subject, and this is the direct object, and stuff. You don't want to do too much of that though, and this is one of the things that I think, one of the many things that where grammar translation has done a disservice. It kind of almost entirely operates at that level, right? Yeah. It's like it envisages a a kind of reading where you are always parsing and always working out explicitly what the grammatical relationship, and that's valuable to do some of the time, but you really want to get to the point where you're just picking up the gist of things, or you've got a, you're familiar enough with certain constructions and so on that you can more fluently read the text, even if there's some words that you don't know, that you might need to look up later or whatever.
Well, and I feel like too, if you consider the amount of scholarship that's been, an ink spilled on biblical texts and Plato and Homer and any of it, the corpus has been around and people much smarter than us have written about it for a thousand years plus. I think one of the biggest payoffs in reading the original sources is you get to notice things like, oh, this is the same word, and it can't be translated the same way because that would be horrible English or whatever your native language is. But
exactly,
like catching those connections, that comes ultimately from extensive reading. Like, so you have to have that fluency. So there's really, like you said, there's nothing wrong with building fluency with a corpus and rereading, like, catch connections.
Yeah, exactly.
And you always find something new. So I think that's pretty cool and a valuable thing to do. So it seems like we've got the text project has a couple of things. We've got these digitized readers from the early 1900s, 1800s, things like that. We've got tools for teachers potentially coming up, and people who want to create their own, write their own stories in Greek, and Old English and probably Latin and other classical languages as well. So text and tools. And as you were talking about these vocabulary sets or ability to assess a text, the leveling and, how many new words and all those things like that. I'm assuming at some point those things could be eventually developed into things that learners themselves, like autodidacts, could access and say, hey, I want to read Plato. Well, where should I start? If I jump into Republic, am I going to drown quickly, or should I go someplace else where the water's a little more shallow first?
Yeah, I mean, certainly my vision, and you and I have talked about this, but just for the rest of the world, my vision is to really have tools that enable people to track the vocabulary that they've seen, that they're familiar with, and then be able to very easily identify those texts of interest to them that are the natural continuation, and to get a sense of what the gap is. So imagine somebody has studied the New Testament, they're comfortable with the New Testament vocabulary, and now they want to try to read Plato. How should they start? What's the gap? What's the vocabulary they should start to learn first? And that sort of stuff is, I think, a really exciting aspect of what we're doing. Because ultimately, and just to bring this back to sort of the way that we learn languages, motivation is hugely important. And the more that we can give people the ability to choose the kinds of texts that they want to read, the better. So if somebody's interested in philosophy, then setting them down a path to read history is not necessarily as interesting. If they're really driven to, I really want to read Plato, or they really, they're into Stoicism and they want to read Epictetus or something. I really want to provide that kind of personalized pathways to the texts that they want to read. But in order to do that, in order to make that learning smooth, we just need more and more texts, right? Because it's in the case of Plato, there was an interesting study. I was trying to look a couple of years ago. I was looking at what would be the easiest Plato to read, assuming you had the vocabulary of the Greek New Testament. And so I assumed, I wrote some code and said, okay, assume you know every word in the Greek New Testament. You could easily do it up to a particular point or whatever, but I think I did it to everything in the Greek New Testament. What sort of vocabulary coverage do you have for various works of Plato? And I was excited to discover there are a couple of works of Plato that are much easier to read than others, given that you know the Greek New Testament. And I was all excited to announce this. And then I thought, hang on a sec. What if I don't assume you know anything? What if I just remove the assumption that you know any vocabulary from the Greek New Testament and evaluate the Plato? Turns out exactly the same works show up. So it turned out to not have anything to do with whether you knew the Greek New Testament or not. It was just there are certain works of Plato that are easier than others from a vocabulary point of view. And so there's all sorts of, interesting things to watch out for there, in terms of assuming what texts are easier than others and why they're easier than others. But yeah, having that kind of empowering students to say, I'm interested in this kind of text. Can you get me there? Is something that really interests me. That kind of because I think people, if somebody knows they're headed towards being able to read a particular text, it's like, to come back to Colin Gorey's Old English stuff. If you are really interested in reading Beowulf, and you know that the made up story that Colin is telling in Old English about a bear called Oswald is going to get you there, that's the extra motivation that you have, and so being able to do that in a customized way for different texts for different students is definitely something that I want to achieve with the Greek Learners Texts project.
Yeah, I've looked at Moss's reader and some of those, and like, the stories are fairly simple and easy to read, and maybe they're not to me as much fun as, well, I like epic poems, whether they're English or whatever. I really would rather just go read Homer, but I think I'd be more likely to, in a sense, put up with a reader if I knew it was getting me to Homer,
right?
So that my experience is a lot better than my current one, where I have to look up every 3 words because it's just such different from anything I'm used to.
So one of the things that I am in the process of building is a reading environment that tracks what vocabulary you are familiar with, and so you can almost set up like goals. Imagine reading these texts that may not be authentic texts. They may have been maybe early 20th century readers or whatever, but as you're reading them and internalizing the vocabulary and so on, you're being told, how close are you to getting to a 95% vocabulary coverage of your favorite work of Plato that you're really excited to read. And so you've kind of got that progression of motivating you to say, okay, every step, every time I'm reading these Greek works, it's getting me closer to where I want to get to with Plato or Homer or the Septuagint or whatever it is that you're wanting to read next.
Yeah, well, that sounds really, really very helpful. And like you said, that would be motivating to learners to keep, pursuing a course of study, to keep at it. Yeah, so we've got, text for learners, text for teachers, tools, things like that. Say I'm a teacher and I want to use one of these digitized texts. Do I have to worry about any licensing restrictions, or once these things are digitized, I know they were public domain. What about now?
Right. Yeah, so it's an important part of everything that we're doing is that it's openly licensed. And so all the code is open source, all the texts and data and everything is made available under a Creative Commons license that is not restricted even for commercial use. So one of the things that I was very clear about early on is that I want to allow commercial use because I want people like Colin or Seamus or you to be able to teach classes with this stuff, right? It's an odd thing with a sort of non-commercial restrictions on Creative Commons licensing of what it means if people are paying you to teach a class with them. So with all of this stuff in the Greek Letter Text projects, there's absolutely no restrictions at all on the text or the code. It's completely freely usable, freely adaptable as well. So if you want to take any of these texts and adapt them in any way for certain contexts, or take the software and modify it for your use, all of that's possible without restriction.
So just say, for argument, I'm a teacher and I want to use like Young's Reader or Moss's Reader, which are either on the project or hopefully will be soon.
Yep.
And I think, okay, I've got a beginning class. These are just a little bit too difficult. I could take that thing, level it down, sell it, put it back online as a new product.
The only requirement is that it is a share alike. So you are required, if you modify the texts, to also make your modifications freely available under the same license.
Okay.
So you can use them commercially, but you've also got to make them freely available to people as well. So that's really trying to encourage people to contribute back to the ecosystem.
Right.
And ultimately benefit everyone from it. So yeah, that is an important aspect of the licensing. It is a share alike license. So yeah, modifications that you make you do need to keep openly available for others to.
Well, that's great. So this is useful for learners. It's useful for teachers. They don't have to worry about somebody coming after them for adapting things,
Right.
and people can keep growing their Greek skills. So how can people stay up to date with what's going on?
Yeah, so probably the best thing at the moment is to follow the website, which we haven't mentioned the address of, but I'm sure you will in show notes or whatever.
I will link to that in the show notes, but it's GreekLearnerText.org, right?
Yes, GreekLearnerText with hyphens.org. That's the best way to kind of track. Who knows? Excuse me. Who knows what the state of Twitter will be? There is a Twitter account, Learning Greek, that I tweet from occasionally with updates, but who knows what the status of Twitter will be in the coming months. We do have also a Slack workspace, although that's more for people that want to actually contribute. But I certainly encourage people who do want to contribute in some way to join the Slack workspace. There's lots of different things to do, different skill levels, and depending on your interests and so on. So it's very easy to find things that areas that people can contribute to.
Okay, cool. So I'll link to that in the show notes, and people can find us there, and I'll probably put your Twitter and stuff in there too.
Yeah.
All right. So my last question, just to wrap up, is what are you working on now that you are most excited about, whether it's Greek or otherwise?
Yeah. So, well, I could go on for a long. There's a few things that are exciting. I mean, one of the things that I'm definitely excited to get back to is some of the stuff I've been talking about today regarding tooling for tracking vocabulary in texts and what texts are readable with certain vocabulary lists. You know, you and I have talked a lot about this sort of the vocabulary tools side of things and helping people to make vocabulary lists for given text and so on. That's a thing that I'm super excited about. I should also mention, though, because it is taking up a lot of my life, I mentioned at the very start the Tolkien stuff and the treating Tolkien's works as objects of philological study in their own rights. That's another big thing that I'm doing, is applying all of the sort of text analysis stuff that I have been doing for the last 30 years for Greek to the texts of Tolkien as well. So there's another project that I head up called the Digital Tolkien Project, which is involved in that too. So they're two of my big passions at the moment: the Digital Text Project and the tooling around the vocabulary stuff for the Greek learner. The two things I'm most excited about.
Well, and as we were talking, we've said this a couple of times, like a lot of the code and tools that work for Greek could probably work just as well for other classical languages, or if you want to study conlangs or whatever, I'm sure some of it could be adapted.
Yep.
And it's licensed, so you're welcome to do so, right?
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, in the case of conlangs, you have to make sure the language itself is not restricted. Right. like Tolkien's are. But yes, all the software and everything is completely open and usable for other languages.
Well, yeah, that's all really cool. Yeah, I really appreciate you taking the time for this interview.
My pleasure.
Yeah, we'll put some links in the show notes. People can follow you and follow the project and keep up to date with what's going on.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Intro and outro music is Funky Thanksgiving by Admiral Bob, used with gratitude under a Creative Commons 3.0 attribution license. The track can be found at dig.ccmixer.org.